Hey everyone, how's it going? We're back with another Svelte Sirens talk. This is our July talk, and today we have Jessica Sachs here with us to do testing in Svelte. I'm very excited to have her. Jessica, would you like to give yourself a brief introduction for the audience?
Sure. My name is Jessica Sachs. I go by Jess usually. I am usually found throughout the Vue ecosystem, but Vue and Svelte share a lot of overlapping features that I love. I recently left my position at Cyprus after building out a team and the Cyprus component testing runner, which is what I'll be talking about today.
Awesome. Do you want to talk any about your new position or?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, I left working in open source so that I could work at Path AI as a staff engineer and build out their design system, which is
Oh, very
what.
cool.
Yeah, you'll see the overlap between component testing and design system development in this talk.
I actually love that. I came from Granger building a design system. So I love design system talk. So I'm excited to hear this talk. If there's no other questions or anything, are you ready to get started?
Quick question from me.
Yeah.
How do I see? Okay, I see the audience comments. Perfect. That's what
Yes,
I
you got
like.
it. Okay.
Yep.
If you need to respond to anything too, it's available on YouTube.
Oh,
You
you
want me to
can't hear
shoot
me
you the
too
link
well.
to that?
One
Oh,
second.
you want
Here.
better?
Yes. Is that, or it's
Okay.
better? I think it's better. I'll
It
let the
does. It
audience
sounds a
tell me.
little better.
Okay, great.
Okay. Yeah, sorry about that. We had that question beforehand too, and I told her the gain was maybe a little too high with the background noise, but I don't hear the background noise now, so I think it's great. All right, we're all set. So I'm going to remove myself and let Jess have the stage and do testing in Svelte.
Sweet. Awesome. Hello, everybody. So this talk is a Cypress component testing talk, but I really consider it to be more of a testable workbench, testable component workbench. So if you've used Storybook before, you're going to see a lot of parallels. If you've used things like Style Guidance before, you're going to see a lot of parallels. So let's get into it. So I practice what is called component driven development. And at this point, I don't know how to live without it. When I first started in front end development, I would build an application and then I would, start with main.svelte, right? Main.view. And then I would build out my application just like it would be in a normal page. And then very early on in my career, I found a website called componentdriven.org. I will put that link somewhere towards the end of this talk. But if you look up component driven, you'll find it. And it is an open standard for and a approach for how to develop. And it's akin to kind of test driven development. I gave my demo or my introduction. I have a strong. What I didn't mention is that I have a very strong background in QA. When I was 16, I dropped out of high school, and I was extremely fortunate to slip, trip, and land on a QA job, an automated QA job. I was coding, Selenium code by the time I was 16 on these nice little iPads. They were Appium Selenium tests, if some people know what that is. I'm in the Vue ecosystem, the vTest ecosystem. I'm currently maintaining Faker.js along with a host of people who are much more active than I am. And I teach on Vue Mastery. I guess the last bullet point I skipped. But I've kind of worn all the hats. I've done product management, I've done engineering management, and I've been a normal IC in addition to QA. So I've thought a lot about testing. I've thought a lot about software holistically outside of just how to build the thing. But the first thing I ask when thinking of quality and testing is, why do we test? Why do we even spend the time? And the answer is confidence. We want to be able to release our code and walk out the door like Morty here, walking out of school in that episode where he in that Love Potion number 9 episode. So we want our bosses to trust our work. Selfishly, we want our bosses to trust our work. And to be a good citizen, we want our teammates to trust our work. When we put up a pull request, a merge request, we want our teammates to be able to look at it, maybe not with a fine-tooth comb. They want to look at the tests, understand the functionality, and then confidently hit that merge button. And finally, we want our users to trust our work. We want the business side of the organization to say, it's okay, our developers got this. And that, feels good inside. And more importantly, our users will trust our product as a function of that. And to develop quickly and confidently, we need an entry point or some way into the code that we write, into the features that we build, to compile and mount our Svelte components, right? Our Vue components, our React components. Generically, we write source code. We need to be able to run and test it. You can do this, like I mentioned in the beginning, through an app.svelte file, or you can isolate it in a test-driven fashion using something like vtest, which is one of the recommended tools for SvelteKit, for testing your SvelteKit app, or something like Storybook, which you are possibly familiar with if you're coming from a React or Vue ecosystem, and Histoire, which is a brand new tool, a drop-in replacement for Storybook that's Vite-based. And again, the Svelte ecosystem is moving towards Vite. Or Cyprus. And we're going to be talking about Cyprus today, but this approach is a general approach. So no matter what tool you're using, it's the workflow that matters. Cyprus has similar architecture goals to vtest, Storybook, and Histoire. At Vue Amsterdam in June, Akrium, one of the Vue core members, released Histoire. There's a strong overlap between the Vue and Vite communities, because the same, Evan Yu wrote Vite as well as Vue. So you're seeing a lot of innovation early on in the Vite space from some Vue core contributors. But the goal is to make it bundler based. And I think Rich Harris said 3 days ago that Vite is this unifying build tool across frameworks. I thought he said it much more eloquently than I did. But I thought that was a really astute observation. Like it was a really correct observation. And so Histoire is this Vite native build tool that allows you to reuse the same build pipeline. And given that Svelte is a compiler, it's difficult to hear what I'm saying. It says, All right, Christopher. I hope this is better. So the architecture goals of Cyprus, Histoire, and vtest are to reuse the same build pipeline. And given that Svelte is a compiler, that's incredibly important that you're using the same Svelte compiler in test that you are in production. Incredibly important. So let's see. Let's go on to the next. So Cyprus, how does Cyprus work? And how does Vite work? So this is a graphic I stole from Hootlex. Who's actually the founder of Vue School, one of the founders of Vue School. But essentially, what you wanna get from this is that Vite, when the server's ready, gets a set of entry points and a set of routes. And whenever you request a route, that's like a page, it will fetch all of the dependent modules. And how does that map onto something like Cyprus or vtest or Histoire? That isn't an application, but wants to use Vite's very fast underlying engine. So essentially, Cyprus adds a plugin on top of Vite, and each page is a spec. So whenever you go to your component.sci.js, it will load all the dependent modules. And we're not doing anything to your bundler config, to your rollup options, to your Vite plugins. We are just saying that whenever you hit this route, or we're basically bundling one route per spec. It's extremely straightforward. So let's build a modal. And this is the workflow that I follow, period. This is just the workflow I do when I develop. And it looks a lot like test-driven development. So I'm already running this. I'm going to close the app. This is Cyprus. I've already opened Cyprus. This is the project we're using. It's the Svelte Cyprus example on the develop branch, and we're in the component testing mode. If you are used to Cyprus, you might be in end-to-end testing, but this is a component testing demo. So we're going to open Chrome Canary, and I already made one spec. It's the counter that everybody is familiar with. And I clicked on the counter, and it loaded the CSS, and it mounted the counter. After we finish, we can interact with it, we can play with it just like a user would, and we can open up the dev tools. And huge disclaimer, I'm a huge noob to Svelte. There's a lot of similarities between Vue and Svelte, so I'm not too worried. I looked through the docs. I did a dry run of this, but if I ask for audience help, don't be surprised. The other reason I didn't educate myself extremely deeply is because I kind of wanted to show you what it's like to be a complete noob and how having the sandbox can actually help you develop and learn for the first time. I've done this with other frameworks as well, where for the first time I'm ever using it, I'm using it in Cyprus, and it's really interesting. It's a very interesting developer experience. So here we are. Here's our dev tools. You're right. Let me blow up the code. There we go. And here's our application under test, or component under test. So there's a general tour of the UI. You can rerun the tests by clicking on the UI. You can open all the specs that you have in your project. And you can get back to what I would call the home page here and create new specs as well. So we're going to build a modal. We're going to create a new spec under source. What's the thing? Source lib modal. Source lib modal. So I'm building out the spec. We're going to call it a base modal. And then we're going to run it. And nothing's rendering because there was no code. So we're going to open in IDE. I haven't ever done this on my computer before, so we're going to open it in Visual Studio Code. And it'll jump to the base modal side TSX. Or TS. Oh, I didn't fix my types before doing this demo. Ooh, I did this on a different computer. And then we're going to make a Svelte file. Base modal Svelte. All right, so, oh no, hot second. Svelte, install. Come on, VS Code. You'll notice that there's no syntax highlighting. We're fixing that right now. Perfect. All right. Okay, so let's get something rendering. So with a modal, generally you have a div, and this div contains some content that's usually like a body. So I would say that this would be, and I like to use, I visually debug, so I'm going to split my panels in half so I can see Cyprus on the left and my stuff on the right. And I'm going to basically build the CSS out first. And then we're going to add the API and functionality. So let's make it background red 100, width full. I'm using Tailwind style utility classes. I'm actually using something called Uno CSS, which is a Vite first version of Tailwind It's very compatible, so you should be able to follow along no problem. All the VS Code extensions I'm using are Tailwind. They have really good compatibility with each other. But because it's Vite first, there are some bugs that it fixes that are not fixed in Tailwind's JIT compiler. If you don't know what that means, it's okay. And let's go into base modal. Let's import base modal from base modal Svelte. And we're going to assign mount it. The signature here is identical to that of the testing library, if you've ever used testing library. Very nice. All right, so next I'm going to figure out why my modal isn't full screen, because I want my modal to be the entire width and height. And that's not cool. So I think what's happening here is that, so width is clearly 100%, but height is not. And we also have this weird situation where, yeah, we also have this weird padding going on. And I think that's because there's no style reset. So we're going to look up how to do a style reset. And it's worth saying that all of the things you're noticing here would be production issues. So if I did this in my app by itself and on a brand new page, these would be real CSS issues. So before we even sew together our application where our modal exists in our app, we are going to fix the issues in isolation. This ensures that when we move our modal onto a brand new page, it's self-sufficient, given that it has a reset, given that it has the CSS library it's using. So we have a pretty decent enumeration of its dependencies. So let's go to the Uno CSS docs and Command F for reset, not preset, we want reset CSS. Style resetting. So normal thing, normalize, boom. I grabbed that from the documentation. We're going to go over to Visual Studio Code, and no matter what testing library I'm using, I always put all of my common shared dependencies with Storybook or Cyprus or whatever in a common file. It's very normal to put them in a main file, and all app scaffolds do this. Like this would be the entry point for a generic Svelte app. I believe that this is a bad practice, especially when you're doing things like initializing plugins. Getting clean state in tests is very difficult. So I always put things like CSS or new stores. I would say, like, Svelte doesn't have this problem. But for other things, I would have like a create store instead of like a store instance that's always alive. So I don't have this dependency because I didn't follow the instructions. Let's follow the instructions. So npm install boop d. So this will happen. Hopefully my internet's very fast. Yeah, I absolutely love npm. It's very helpful when you're linking as well. My internet is crawling. Wow. All right. Let us reload. Nope. I think I have to bounce my, I think I have to bounce everything. But don't worry about it. We'll just go to normalize CSS and pull the raw from it. Perfect. I'm going to slam it here. I'm going to slam it inside of the main CSS. It's a terrible place to put it. And then our CSS is reset. And we can see that we want our HTML document to be width and height 100%. This is really interesting. But let's go over there. HTML body, let's do height is going to be 100 VH. Body is going to be 100, or width is going to be 100 VW. Perfect. And now we can actually isolate what's wrong with our, what's wrong with stuff. Actually, nothing is wrong with it. I'm just bad at CSS. I'm so sorry. The reason this is not working is because I'm not an absolute. So we want to be an absolute. We want to be left of 0 and then bottom of 0. I think this will work. No, I have to go through the normal compiler. Yeah, that's silly. Absolute. All right, very good. Thanks, everybody. So in general, after we have our little modal with width to height 100, I took off the background colors so that I could debug a little bit better, but I guess maybe I'll leave it on. Let's do background, let's say green, 200. Let's say it's going to be top of 20. And then we're going to make this center. So let's say margin top of 20. And then let's say item center, justify center. And so then that should center it. And then let's say a height is going to be 300 pixels or something like that. And then let's say a width is going to be, I don't know, 400 pixels or something like that. I don't remember if I have to escape the brackets or not. Perfect. Okay, so after that we have, let's center everything in here. So flex, item center, justify content. Perfect. And then probably like text center. All right. And this is the point in which I would add a slot. Now that we have our content here, we have a slot. I'm not going to add the slot yet. Just go with me on this. And I'm going to add another wrapper div in order to center this. So class is going to be with full and then text center. Great. So now we have a beautiful modal. It's very ugly and we don't like it, but it's good enough. So in production, we're not going to want to have a background of red. That's terrible. And we're also not going to want a background of green. We'll probably just want a border of 1. And the border is going to be like gray. So border gray of 200. Let's have a shadow of medium. That's a very big shadow, but perfect. And then finally, we're going to have an X button. Do you say gray or gray? Finally, we're going to have an X button. I'm using divs for everything because I'm going fast. Oh no, my emoji key is broken. Oh, that's sad. So the X button is going to be absolute. It's going to be on the top, on the right, 2, top 2. And then that means that, if you're wondering, this is kind of why I like to dev in Cyprus. We just found another CSS bug and I'm able to quickly just say, just kidding, the reason that this is an issue is that the parent needs to be relative to contain. Okay, perfect. We have a scaffold of a component. And so now it's time to get Svelte. So let's go and say, oh my goodness, is it bind click or on click? Sorry, I'm mixing my syntaxes. On click, thank you. On click. Let's make that happy. And then we're going to start saying show is going to be equal to bang show. And it's going to say, I don't know what show is. And we'll say, no, show is going to be, let show is, let's set it to true for now. And now we're going to put an if statement around our thing. Can I put if statements on the block level? Okay. Where are the docs? Boop, boop, boop. Perfect. Okay, that's what I was looking for. Hashtag and then end close. Perfect. Yeah. Perfect. So if true, if false, perfect, that looks about right. And so the final thing to do here is to click on the X button. So let's say data test ID. If I was doing this in any sort of reasonable way, and I will show you this in a second, I would use an accessible selector. None of these would be divs. And this would be a button with reasonable text and not an X. So just like huge disclaimer there. Okay, so now that we finished our modal, we can, I always declare my selectors up top. Close button selector is going to be equal to data test ID of close. If I'm using testing library and Cyprus has compatibility with all testing library selectors, I might write up the constants up here. And so you can see Cyprus is starting to find things. Cyprus is like, yeah, okay, that's close. And we can say click. Okay, yeah, cool. Before we close it, I want to make sure that I can get the, so if you're used to get by text with testing library, there's something called contains. So we're going to just grab the body really quick, and this will get less awful in a second. Like, we're going to make this, I'm going to show you how to accept slots in a second. Okay, so it's like, yeah, I found hello world. Actually, I'm gonna do the slot now. So let's do data test ID of overlay. I'm gonna put it all the way at the top because if this existed, then it would capture the click and it would make the whole page unusable. So let's make a selector, const overlay selector is equal to data test ID of overlay. Get overlay selector should be visible. I'm going to kill this contains. And then we're going to, so we're first, this is called, if you're used to a given when then pattern, this is the initial state, the given. So given that your overlay worked in the first place, it should be visible. And so you're starting from a known good state. You're like, okay, it's not that the overlay has never shown up and clicking the close button selector, you know, it still doesn't show up. You're making sure that first, given that everything's working, like given that there is an overlay, then when you, let's just write when. Given that everything's working, when you click this, then when you go back and you get the overlay selector again, it should not exist. And that is how you build a modal, and it is accidentally testable because we did most of the time we spent was messing around in CSS, and like this should parallel your workflow, right? This should be a complete parallel to your workflow. Most of the time you spend in JavaScript development of a new component is probably in CSS, building the actual structure of it. And then after you're done with it, you can go ahead and easily write the test in the same environment you were using to develop. Awesome possum. So this isn't fully featured. Brittany, what do we have for time? Do we have 30, 45, or an hour? 30 more. Okay, great. Okay, so given one then. So this is like the base functionality for an overlay, or for a modal for an overlay. So the next things that we would want probably are to say we want to control export let initially visible is going to be equal to, let's say, true. Am I doing this fine? Export const, sorry. Unused. Okay, so it's just mad that I haven't used it. So I would probably say show is equal to initially visible so that the parent can say initially, like, should this be visible or not? Cool. And now we're going to use, you see we have like it playground. We're going to be better about this. It should not be visible by default. All right, so that's the first thing. It should not be visible by default. Or it should. There we go. So it should be visible by default, which is basically a copy paste of this half of it. Should be visible by default. Next, it can be controlled. It has an initially visible prop, which can be controlled by the parent. I think that's redundant. Okay, so let's copy paste the test and pass in a prop. So let's say we have props initially visible is going to be equal to false. And we have a bug. Initially visible. Is that what I called it? Yes. Base modal has props of initially visible. That's confusing. So when I'm confused, I isolate using it only. And I don't know why that's not initially visible. So let's set it to false. So there's something in the layer, in the mounting layer of base modal, where props aren't getting passed through. No. That's not great. That is very much not great. So, let's see what we got going on here. So the way that I did this, this is why this is a preview of Cyprus's support, by the way. I did this last night. The way that the mount command works, I can explain it to you. It is almost a duplication of the testing library mount command. And we're going to get a little more advanced now because I'm going to show you the implementation because it's dead simple. So because we're not able to get initially visible working because I have a bug in my implementation, we have a choice. We can jump ahead to the way that you can test slots and props, etc. We can jump ahead, or we can dive into the implementation of testing library, which is actually not scary at all. I promise. So, all right. So let's go ahead and review existing docs for how to unit test slots, and we'll go over that, and then we can start looking through why props aren't getting passed through. So currently on sveltesociety.dev, there are a set of recipes. They're a little out of date, but no big deal, that talk about how to unit test Svelte components. They use the testing library for Svelte. Yes, exactly. I saw in the GitHub issues that there's a refactor of the site in progress. Yeah. And it talks about how to test component events, and it also talks about testing slots. And the recommendation is actually really interesting. And it's something that we do in the Vuetify documentation, which is or the Vuetify tests, which is the Vue version of Material UI, the Material UI implementation for Vue. And it's that we ingest examples and stories, basically, right? Either documentation, stories, entire components that use the component under test. So this component to be tested, for example, this is the component under test. And we have this slot test component, which is a wrapper for the component to be tested. Extremely interesting, because this is essentially a story. And when we think about the future of component-driven development and how to quite easily go from stories, right? These are essentially stories minus the knobs, to testable render functions. This is one of the first steps, right? Is getting those render functions into a collection, right? A set of stories, and then testing each one of them. Because Svelte is a compiler, the most important part, in my opinion, of testing a Svelte component is making sure it follows through the same Svelte compilation path. And right now, there aren't a lot of solutions for testing things that aren't programmatically accessible. So when you're trying to do things like test slots or the Svelte inline compiler, these are the ways that people are able to test some things in isolation. And you're talking about like script template or template functions. And it sucks because the difference between running Svelte inline compile and the entire Svelte compiler ideally is very, very small. And every time you introduce something that's a test-only step, a test-only build step, you leave yourself open for bugs that are test-only bugs. And with Svelte, Svelte is a compiler. The most important thing is that the compiler you're using in prod is equivalent to the compiler you're using when you're developing or testing. Because you want to maintain confidence in your infrastructure and your pipeline. So ideally, so actually this is a very, very good workaround because you reuse that Vite in my case, right? In the application we're using's case, the Vite Svelte compiler. So I thought this was a very interesting approach. Let's see. So yeah. Let us see. So we did the base. We did the base here. We can start to look at the testing library, the Svelte testing library mount, and see what's different. So Svelte testing library is the current recommendation, and will probably remain the recommendation for testing Svelte components. It's used for basically every framework, and it has a very similar API no matter what framework you're in. The way that Cyprus works is it gives you a target, right, which is this iframe. Let's make this bigger so you can see it. The way that Cyprus works is it gives you an iframe, basically a target, and you can mount onto that. Svelte is extremely simple, which is lovely, as when it comes to mounting components. In Vue, we have all these global considerations like plugins, right? Globally registered components, etc. And in the testing library for Svelte, there's none of that, which is pretty cool. There's this helper called check props that's just like Essentially, if you're not using TypeScript or you don't have good types, you won't get this help in IntelliSense. So it gives you a runtime check. All of this is not necessary. And then you have your component constructor, which is either going to be on default or not. After you grab your props, you're just going to call new. And then you have your component. You're going to give it the target that you want to bind on, and then you're going to spread out the options. So if, given that the initially visible prop isn't being listened to, that's what I want to start debugging. So let's pop open this little guy. And this is, by the way, a preview for the actual official version of the Svelte mounting library that Cyprus will be releasing in 2 months. So we're about 2 months early. I have done a playground, a sandbox of this implementation a few times. But this is the first time I'm giving a talk about it. So let's say initially invisible is false, or initially visible is false. Let's reload. So we're in a fresh state. I'm hitting R to reload. And then let's debug. So I'm going to step into the mount command. So you can import mount like as a function from Cyprus Svelte in the experimental branch that I have. And instead of a globally registered function, we're going to just do mount like this. Pretty sure it should be props, and I did type it correctly, so but don't worry about it. Let's just go to the implementation. So go to implementation. Nope. Let's go to the debugger. Cyprus has a .debug, but we can also just go and type in debugger, and that'll pop that open. It's source mapped, or it should be. Perfect. This is compiled code because this is what I wrote the other day. Very nice. So I did not source map this. It's not going to be too bad. This is the component constructor that we were talking about just now. And so we get there, no problem. And then we have options. And so options has props inside of it with initially visible as false. I think this should work. I also append it to the Cypress object if you need to do things like on and set. So if you are used to, we have this problem in Vue test utils, people want to get at the underlying component instance. You can still do that. We don't recommend it in general. But at this point, we should have a component that has initially visible set to false. So let's go options, .props, initially visible is false. And so I really think that, is it just that I don't understand Svelte? Did I just do it wrong? Because that could be a completely reasonable answer. But I'm pretty sure I did this right. If Brittany's there, or if what is setting it to false? I'm using it as false, right? So I'm saying that, okay, I have base modal, and I think base modal should have initially visible to false, and so I want this to override. I'll put a debugger in here as well. Reload. So this is the test debugger, and then this is the breakpoint I put. And so here's the Svelte source mapped file. And then initially visible is true once I get here. But it's my understanding, given that I copy pasted this code, sure, I'll set it to null or undefined. So first breakpoint, here we are. It's definitely overwriting it. which is confusing me. I feel like anybody, yeah.
Oops. I'm gonna go back
Yeah,
to
please.
this view maybe. Yeah,
Please.
I don't know.
It's
I'm
yeah, this seems seems counterintuitive to me that this would like this should be I'm just calling new on base modal, right? So like if we went into the code for the mount, I'm just grabbing base modal right here. Just reload the page.
so you're grabbing the component.
Yeah, so here we are. We have a reference to base modal. There's no parent here. We're just gonna call new on it like it's an app almost. There's no default because we're not in Webpack. And then we grab the component constructor and
So
call
is it
new.
initializing the component there without a
Yeah,
parent?
it is. This is
So
the root. Yeah, this is the root. Do you think it needs
so
a
if it
parent?
doesn't, yeah, it needs a parent because that prop is being exported so that the parent can access it. So the parent actually sets the variable to change it. So when it's initializing that component, if nothing is setting that variable, then it's going to initialize it with whatever's set in the component, I think is what's going on.
It's how do you set props on app? Can you?
I
'cause
don't
this is
think you can.
it's interesting because I grabbed
Could,
it from here and there's no parent here. You know what I mean? Like it's treating it as root here as well. This isn't SvelteKit.
no, it's not SvelteKit or Sapper. This is just the
This is
client-side rendered
vanilla.
version of Svelte.
Yeah, this is vanilla, like a Vite scaffold, so like Vite init with the Svelte template is what this is. There's nothing fun. I wonder if it's like literally that I need to unpack options or something like that. But options should be props, I feel like. Yeah.
And it's showing there as false, but yeah, it's a Vite template for Svelte.
Yeah. Props, options, props, foo. I'm gonna change it to foo just because I'm like paranoid. I did this last night, which is the freaky part. It's like I did this whole thing last night.
And this all worked.
Yeah,
This is
this
like
all
live
worked.
coding at its best,
Oh
right?
yeah. I don't mind. I think it's interesting for people to see generally
I do
developing it,
too.
and it's a good opportunity to talk through. All right, so we have foo. Yeah. It's a good opportunity to talk through the implementation of how to do any component testing because like people can see literally all that's happening is that you grab the component node, right, that Cyprus gives you, like it just creates, and this should be pretty familiar for people who have ever done Jess testing before testing library existed. Is you create this target and then you just append onto it. It's fairly straightforward. That's why I think I'm just like, am I just like typoing it? Like, yeah. But options, props, foo is false. Yeah.
I just don't know how the compiler is treating that. If it's initializing the component with a prop without a parent setting that prop, I feel like that's got to be the problem because only the child can set it if there's no parent to override it.
So props don't work for root components.
So can I see your app.svelte file? Are you using it
App
in the...
isn't even, yeah, like you should think of base as app. Base modal is basically the app because it's the root
Okay.
mode. Like,
So, yeah, that's just like the
so
only file you have.
yeah, it's like saying new app basically
Okay.
and
Yep.
passing in props to app, which is unusual, but for testing is like
Yeah, I
reasonable thing
don't
to do.
think that will work because a prop is meant to go up to its parent. So I don't know if you can do a prop in the root.
Interesting. So what that means is that that's super weird because literally like that's what they're doing in testing library.
I mean, maybe I'm wrong. That's just kind of like my mental model of it is they lift up to the parent.
Yeah, generally that's the way you would functionally write them. For testing frameworks, sometimes you do weird things in order to isolate, right? Like you don't like the existence of a parent would be only to get it to work.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, the existence of a parent isn't really like functionally like necessary or like theoretically necessary. It would only be to get around a compiler limitation, and it doesn't seem like it's necessary for these people. Is exploding props? Yeah, this would just say target and props, and with options. Okay. Well, I will take this. I will take this. And if you're wondering if you want to follow along, with the progress on this pull request, including the tests that don't exist, it would be Svelte.
Yes.
It would be this pull request, which is in drafts.
And if you need to drop that link in the private chat, I can link it back over to YouTube
Please.
for them.
But yeah, this is the current PR. Cyprus is gonna do the way I would work around this, by the way, if I wasn't trying to debug it live, is I would do the stories thing. I would say like base modal.stories.svelte.
I was wondering if this would work, as if you're creating that parent kind of container for it.
Yeah, like I think this will work fine because I'm not going to use the props API, but like let's just try it before I go back to slides. So we're going to import, let's say, base modal from base modal svelte, and then we're going to say base modal. I might say something like can you do raw fragment or text outside?
You can.
Okay.
I don't even know what the markup comes out as. Probably a P tag? I don't know.
Okay, so we're going to do a hello world, which has a base modal. There's no props yet. And we're going to swap over to base modal stories.stories.svelte. And then we're going to say it only works maybe. And then we're gonna do SciMount on base modal stories. And then right here in the source maps, it's yelling at me. It says
unterminated string literal.
Perfect. Okay, so okay, that works. And now we're gonna say foo is the whatchamacallit is gonna be false. And I can string terminate it if I want. So yeah, so it's the props API. So it's not that I don't know Svelte, it's the props API on the root needs some love. And I got it wrong when I did it yesterday. I'm very interested to see what the difference, because I can't tell what the difference is between the testing library implementation and the Cyprus one. So that's interesting to me. I'm just like, I didn't do anything differently. Yeah.
I don't know who it is that does the Svelte testing library. I would like to have them on and see that.
If I remember right, let's see. Reactive Flux at admin. Yeah. I don't know any of these people. I felt like Async would know, given that he does vtest. if you know him in Discord. But yeah, so this is the current status of Svelte support, 2 months before it's ready for the actual Svelte Summit talk. So happy early preview to those.
It's like the preview talk.
Oh yeah. This is definitely the preview talk. But yeah, the slots thing was very interesting to me, and as was the stories thing. I think maybe if we're lucky, Histoire will have finished their stories API, which allows you to define stories as components, kind of globally. And then you would be able to use the parent, base modal stories to get an enum of all of your different stories, and each story would define like a testing scenario that you were interested in exercising. This is something I think would work very well for Svelte, as it does for Vue, because it's single file based.
Yes.
Very nice. Okay. Thank you all for being so patient. And current framework support, we have support for all major React and Vue frameworks. Angular is coming next month. Angular is coming in August. It's already in the code base, so if you were to go to Cyprus.io /Cyprus npm Angular, so sibling to our friend here, you would be able to see the Angular version. And then also, you can technically use it. You would have to fix the props issue I just ran into. I think it's just that I don't understand the programmatic API very well for Svelte. It's not officially supported. And we do have an open issue with Svelte Kit library authors. This is why I stopped working on the Svelte support, is I got blocked and am probably unblocked by now by 2 maintainers, Rich included, but I don't have the issue up. And then fancy new features, create from story, so it'll integrate with component story format. So if you have existing stories, you can import them, generate a bunch of specs from them, and then also create for component from component, which works very well with Vue and Svelte files because they don't have a bunch of named exports. They just export default, so it's actually very easy to create from component for single file components. And I would say, in general, for things that render, I'm leaning towards Cyprus. Obviously, you have to wait for Svelte and Angular a little bit longer. And I'm leaning towards vtest and Jest for business logic, because Cyprus can test anything that runs in a browser, just based on its architecture. And vtest and Jest can test using an emulated DOM, and that is really great and much, much faster for business logic, but you wouldn't be able to debug things like visibility and such. So, for example, before we sign off, I would say, let's comment this little buddy out, and I'll show you what I mean. So let's say that we have, it should be visible by default, and somebody's developing and they're going to use Svelte's amazing transitions API and animations API using either classes or something. Essentially, if you do things like set visibility, so let's say opacity is 0 on parent, Cyprus will throw and tell you, hey, by the way, this element is not visible. We were able to find it in the DOM. So this element that you have right here is not visible because it has a CSS opacity property of 0. And those kinds of things like, Z-1? Z-1 will work fine. Those kinds of things like display none or hidden, all of these will get checked for implicitly in your visibility checks. And then if you wanted to do things like cover up the X button, for example, let's say I'm going to click here, we're at 1. All right. If you wanted to do things like cover up the click button with another parent element, Cyprus would throw right here. Some really, really powerful driver assertions that don't exist in other tools. That really drive me to use Cyprus instead of node-based emulators, and you would get that feedback as you're developing rather than after you're done with your CSS and you figure out, oh wait, I clicked on this X button and nothing happened. The user can never dismiss the overlay. It's like the only environment that lets you do that right now. Yeah. So that is my demo of the very, very pre-release alpha version of Svelte.
Awesome.
Thank you for coming. Thank you for dealing with my live coding.
I think, like you said, I think it's great to see that debugging process and the thought process and talk through it. And thank you so much for coming to do this. I love getting the little preview, and I'm very excited to meet you at Svelte Summit and see the official talk. So I'm super excited, and stay tuned. I think next month we have Josephine from Storyblock coming on, but I don't have a date yet. So just stay tuned on what's coming next for August for Svelte Sirens. And thank you everyone for joining us, and we will catch y'all next time. Bye.